On July 4, 1942, the streets of central London filled with a sound the city had never heard before, the steady, rolling cadence of American boots. Beneath gray summer clouds, U.S. Army columns swung down the mall toward Horse Guards Parade. The stars and stripes rippled beside the Union Jack, two flags sharing the same war for the first time in a generation. On the pavements, Londoners pressed against the barriers, office clerks on their lunch break, women in factory overalls, children clutching paper flags, old men in First World War medals. Near the reviewing stand, a stocky, 67-year-old man in a dark overcoat and Homburg hat watched the approaching ranks. Winston Churchill had stood on these streets for countless parades in peace and in war. But this one was different. These were not British troops or Empire contingents. They were strangers, tall Midwestern farm boys, New York dockworkers, Southern volunteers, their uniforms still stiff with newness, their helmets sitting a little too high. Churchill studied their faces as they passed, chewing gum, grinning awkwardly at the cheering crowds, trying to keep in step to unfamiliar British drums. Around them London still bore the scars of the Blitz, bombed-out churches, jagged gaps where houses had once stood, blackout paint clinging to lampposts. The city was tired. So was its prime minister. For nearly 2 years, Britain had endured the war largely alone. France had fallen in June 1940. The Luftwaffe's bombs had turned night into an inferno over London, Coventry, Liverpool. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, threatening to starve the island of food and fuel. In the summer of 1941, Hitler had hurled millions of men into the Soviet Union, and by 1942 German forces stood deep inside Russia and across North Africa. Japan's conquests in the Pacific seemed unstoppable. To many Britons, it had felt as if the world were collapsing inward. But as Churchill watched those first American units march past, soldiers of the U.S. Army Air Forces, engineers, supply troops, he was seeing something he had long hoped for made flesh. The alliance that had existed only in speeches, telegrams, and secret agreements was now visible in khaki and steel helmets. 7 months earlier, on the night of December 7, 1941, he had received the phone call reporting the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Later, in his memoirs, Churchill would recall slipping into bed after that news with a sense of profound relief, writing that he'd slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. The United States was in the war. So we had won after all, he confided to a colleague that same night. Yet hope on paper is one thing, hope marching past in organized columns is another. The sight of American troops on London streets signaled more than just reinforcement. It meant industrial might on a scale Hitler could never match. It meant ships, bombers, tanks, millions of men who, in time, would cross the Channel and storm into occupied Europe. For the ordinary Londoner in the crowd, the emotional stakes were immediate and raw. A son might now survive because these strangers would share the danger. A city which had stood in the dark, waiting for the next siren, could finally believe that the burden was being shared. The roar that greeted each passing unit was less a cheer for a parade than a release of 2 years of pent-up fear. But Churchill's reaction was more complicated than simple relief. As Prime Minister, he knew alliances were never pure gifts. The same power that might save Britain could, if mishandled, overshadow it. America's arrival would transform not only the war, but the balance of power within the Allied camp, and in the world that would come after. On that July morning, as American boots echoed between the bomb-scarred buildings of London, Churchill faced a question that would shape his every word and gesture toward his new partners. How could he welcome this vast new ally with genuine gratitude, while ensuring that Britain did not vanish in its shadow? When the American columns passed the saluting base that July morning, the moment carried the weight of months of frantic diplomacy and fear. 7 months earlier, on the night of December 7, 1941, Churchill had been dining at Checkers when the telephone rang with the news from Washington: Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor. For a man who had spent the previous year wondering when Britain's strength would finally crack, the implication was immediate and overwhelming. Later, he would write that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. It was not joy at America's suffering. It was the grim conviction that the one power with the industry to match Germany and Japan had now been forced into the struggle. So we had won after all, he later recalled thinking. England would live. Within days, Churchill was on the battleship HMS Duke of York, plowing across a winter Atlantic still thick with U-boats. Reaching Washington, D.C. on December 22, he was greeted at the White House by President Franklin Roosevelt. The two men, already connected by months of secret correspondence and the Lend-Lease lifeline, now set about turning words into a shared war. During the Arcadia Conference that followed, British and American planners hammered out the foundations of the alliance. They created a combined Chiefs of Staff committee to coordinate global strategy and, crucially, agreed that defeating Germany would take priority over Japan. It was a cold, rational decision. Germany was the more dangerous industrial enemy, but it meant American soldiers would soon be on European soil. Yet Churchill knew that this would not happen overnight. In early 1942, the United States was still mobilizing. Its peacetime army was small, its navy reeling from losses. American factories were only beginning their transformation into the arsenal of democracy. Ships had to be built, divisions raised, supplies assembled. Britain could not simply order up armies as if from a catalog. The first American combat troops to reach the European theater came quietly. On January 26, 1942, elements of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division disembarked at Belfast in Northern Ireland. There was no grand London parade, no roaring crowds, just cold docks and the knowledge, for those who understood, that a door had opened. In London, Churchill followed each of these movements in the daily reports. He understood that every regiment and every ship committed across the Atlantic was a political act as much as a military one. The Soviet Union, bleeding on the Eastern Front, was demanding a second front in the West. American generals like George C. Marshall pressed for an early cross-channel invasion in 1942. Churchill, haunted by the slaughter of the Somme and Dunkirk, believed such a move would be suicide. Beneath the public warmth between Roosevelt and Churchill lay hard questions. Who would command combined operations? Where would the first blow fall, France, North Africa, or the Far East? How could Britain protect its battered empire while accepting American strategic priorities? Churchill needed American strength, but he could not afford to let Britain become merely a junior partner in its own war. Meanwhile, life in Britain grew harder. In February 1942, Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fell to the Japanese, shocking imperial confidence. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened Egypt and the Suez Canal. Rationing tightened, air raids continued, families scanned the casualty lists with a familiar dread. Against this backdrop, the arrival of more substantial American forces in Britain under the codename Operation Bolero took on enormous symbolic value. Camps, depots, and airfields spread across the countryside. Green American uniforms began appearing in village pubs and railway stations. Still, for Londoners, the alliance remained largely an abstraction until that July day when Churchill arranged for U.S. troops to march through the heart of the capital. The parade was carefully staged. Newsreel cameras rolled. Photographs would be sent not only across Britain and America, but into occupied Europe and, just as importantly, to Moscow. The message was simple: Britain no longer stood alone, the English-speaking powers were shoulder to shoulder. Yet even as he raised his hat in salute, Churchill knew that the real test of this partnership would not be decided on London's streets. It would be fought in planning rooms thick with cigarette smoke, where British caution would soon collide with American impatience over when and where to strike at Hitler's fortress Europe. On the reviewing stand at Horse Guards Parade, the July wind tugged at flags and greatcoats alike. Churchill stood flanked by British generals and American officers as the first U.S. units swung past, their columns framed by the soot-stained facades of Whitehall. The parade had been timed with deliberate symbolism. It was the 4th of July, America's Independence Day, and now, in the middle of Britain's capital, the descendants of those who had once fought British redcoats were marching under their own flag beside the Union Jack. Newsreel cameras lingered on the image, the stars and stripes dipping in salute before a British Prime Minister who had built his career on the defense of empire. Churchill understood the irony, and he embraced it. When he addressed the crowd and the microphones gathered for broadcast, his words did what his best speeches always did. They turned a complex political moment into a simple, emotional truth. He spoke of shared dangers and shared ideals, of how the liberties proclaimed in Philadelphia in 1776 were now under mortal threat from tyranny in Berlin and Tokyo. Britain and America, he declared, were not merely allies of convenience, they were fighting for the same civilization. He told Londoners that the presence of these American soldiers meant Britain was no longer standing alone on the cliff edge. For their part, the U.S. troops heard themselves described not as visitors, but as comrades whose fate was bound up with that of the British people. The message was crafted as much for listeners in Chicago and New York as for those shivering on London pavements. That night, Churchill's words carried over the BBC and across the Atlantic on shortwave. In essence, he argued that the war had become a single struggle, with no separate British, American, or Russian victories, only one common victory or one common ruin. It was a theme he returned to again and again in private and in public. If the Allies allowed suspicion and rivalry to divide them, Hitler would exploit every crack. Yet no one was more aware than Churchill that beneath the soaring language lay very real tensions. In war cabinet discussions, he spoke bluntly about the Americans. Their enthusiasm was welcome, he said, but they were inexperienced in modern continental warfare. He worried that a premature assault on France, urged by some in Washington, would simply repeat the tragedies of 1915 and 1916, hundreds of thousands of men thrown against strong German positions for scant gain. American leaders had their own concerns. From their perspective, Britain looked like an aging empire clinging to past glories, reluctant to take the kind of risks necessary to defeat Hitler swiftly. General George C. Marshall pressed hard for a direct blow across the Channel in 1942 or 1943. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin hurled accusations of cowardice at both London and Washington, insisting that every month without a Western front was paid for in Soviet blood. Churchill's public praise of American troops marching through London can only be understood against this backdrop of competing pressures. By celebrating their arrival so extravagantly, he was doing more than boosting morale. He was sending a reassurance to Moscow that the Western Allies were serious, and a reassurance to Washington that Britain welcomed American power rather than feared it. Privately, however, he also chose his words to preserve British influence. He emphasized the unity of purpose between the two nations, but he never presented Britain as a junior partner. In his rhetoric, the alliance of the English-speaking peoples was a partnership of equals, Britain with its experience, America with its industrial might, both indispensable. The contrast between words and looming decisions would soon become stark. Even as Churchill spoke of common purpose, Allied planners were moving toward a compromise that would sidestep an immediate invasion of France. Instead, they were considering a bold strike at a different target, one that would test the new partnership in fire and controversy. The American troops who marched past Churchill that day could not know it, but many of them would soon be bound not for the beaches of Normandy, but for a very different shoreline, under a harsher sun. In the days after the Independence Day parade, London settled back into its weary routine. The sirens still sounded at night, ration lines still stretched along gray pavements, and in Downing Street the war remained a relentless stack of files and decisions. Yet something in the atmosphere had shifted. The sight of American troops on London streets had given physical form to an alliance that was still being argued over in the highest councils of war. Inside the cabinet war rooms, map pens and colored threads showed the scale of the problem. In Russia, the Wehrmacht still drove deep into the Don Basin and toward the Caucasus. In Egypt, Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened to punch through to the Nile. Churchill's generals, led by the cautious and methodical Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, believed Britain could not yet hurl itself, even with American help, against the fortified coast of France. Across the Atlantic, however, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall saw things differently. He feared that any delay in opening a Western front would drain Soviet strength and allow Germany to consolidate its gains. He pressed for a cross-channel invasion, first codenamed Sledgehammer, then Roundup, as early as 1942 or 1943. To Marshall, peripheral operations in the Mediterranean looked like a way to bleed resources without striking at the heart of Hitler's empire. Churchill found himself caught between gratitude and apprehension. The Americans were now indispensable, their factories and manpower would decide the war's outcome. But he believed firmly that a headlong rush into France would be, in his own phrasing, a forlorn hope, not a strategy. To his mind, the Western Allies had to choose their first major blow with care, somewhere they could win convincingly and learn to fight together before facing the main German armies. In this climate of argument, the July 4th parade became more than ceremony. It was a message. Britain welcomed American arms, and was prepared to share both glory and sacrifice. In private, Churchill told colleagues that the arrival of U.S. troops on British soil meant that any Allied plan, whether his or Marshall's, would now be backed by resources on a scale Hitler could never hope to match. Through the summer of 1942, the debate intensified. Stalin railed at the delay in opening a second front. American newspapers demanded action. Behind closed doors in Washington, President Roosevelt weighed his options. In late July, he made a crucial choice. Instead of an immediate invasion of France, the Western Allies would strike first in North Africa. The operation would be called Torch. For Churchill, the decision was vindication. Torch offered a target where Allied naval power could be brought fully to bear, where German forces were relatively thin, and where victory could secure the Mediterranean and relieve pressure on Egypt. It also offered something else, a joint campaign in which British experience and American energy would be bound together in the field. He later described the moment as one of intense relief. The alliance he had labored to build would not be squandered in a premature disaster on the French coast. Instead, it would test its strength in a campaign where success seemed possible. As planning for Torch accelerated, the American presence in Britain grew. Airfields in East Anglia filled with U.S. bombers and their crews. Camps sprang up in quiet English villages. GIs brought with them chocolate, cigarettes, jazz records, slang, and a different kind of confidence. Many British civilians welcomed them warmly. Others, worn down by years of war, muttered that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. Churchill watched these social frictions with concern. He instructed ministers and local authorities that American troops were not merely visitors but partners whose morale mattered to Britain's own survival. Publicly, he continued to speak of them with deliberate warmth, describing the young giants from across the ocean who had come to stand with Britain in its hour of trial. Behind the praise, he never forgot the stakes. If the first major Anglo-American operation faltered, if Torch ended in confusion or defeat, the political consequences could be disastrous. Isolationist voices in the United States might argue that Europe was a hopeless quagmire. Soviet distrust of the Western Allies would harden into open hostility years before the war's end. On the morning of November 8, 1942, as Allied convoys approached the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, Churchill knew that many of the Americans who had marched through London that July were about to face fire for the first time. Their parade had been watched by cheering crowds and newsreel cameras. Their next march would be under hostile guns. He had hailed their arrival as proof that Britain was no longer alone. Now the question hanging over the war rooms was brutally simple: could this new alliance deliver victory on a real battlefield? The guns off North Africa gave their own answer to the question hanging over the alliance. Operation Torch, launched on November 8, 1942, was no flawless masterpiece. American troops stumbled ashore at beaches around Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca, colliding with confused resistance from Vichy French forces. Communications broke down, landing craft drifted off course, and some units met unexpectedly fierce fire. Yet within days, ports that had flown the tricolor of a government collaborating with Hitler were instead receiving Allied convoys. In London's underground war rooms, pins were shifted, lines redrawn. Torch did what Churchill had hoped. It proved that British and American forces could plan and execute a major joint operation. It opened a new front against the Axis, encircling Rommel between Montgomery's 8th Army driving west from Egypt and fresh Allied forces pushing east from Algeria and Morocco. Many of the Americans who had marched past Churchill that July now fought under a very different sky. Some fell at Kasserine Pass in early 1943, where inexperienced U.S. units were mauled by veteran German troops. Churchill followed every report, noting grimly how inexperience was being burned away in blood. But he also saw something else. The Americans learned fast. Within months they were back on the offensive, and by May 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia laid down their arms. North Africa was in Allied hands. The victory changed more than the map. It cemented the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American commander of Torch, as the man who could coordinate British and U.S. forces with tact as well as firmness. It gave Roosevelt and Churchill a shared success to point to, proof that the marriage of their nations was producing results. From North Africa the Allied tide flowed onto Sicily in July 1943, then onto the Italian mainland. Each step tightened the ring around Hitler's Europe. Yet even as fighting raged in the Mediterranean, Churchill knew that the decisive blow lay elsewhere. The real reckoning with Nazi power would still have to be faced across the Channel. Back in Britain, Operation Bolero accelerated. What had begun as a trickle of U.S. forces in early 1942 became a flood. By late 1943, more than 1 million American servicemen were stationed in the British Isles. The friendly invasion transformed villages and market towns. Concrete runways scarred old pastureland, Nissen huts sprouted in hedgerows, endless columns of olive-drab trucks clogged narrow roads built for horse carts. For Londoners, the July 1942 parade came to seem like a prologue, a first glimpse of a presence that would soon feel almost overwhelming. GIs crowded pubs and dance halls, lined up beside Britons in canteens and cinemas, and filled the capital with unfamiliar accents. Some Londoners resented them, many grew fond of them, countless romances blossomed in the shadows of bombed-out buildings. Churchill watched this deepening entanglement with a strategist's eye. American boots in London streets were no longer a symbolic reassurance. They were the visible edge of an enormous buildup whose purpose could not be concealed forever. Something vast was coming, and the Germans, watching from across the Channel, knew it too. At the Quebec Conference in August 1943 and later at Tehran in November, Churchill and Roosevelt, under unrelenting pressure from Stalin, finally fixed the shape of that something. There would be a massive cross-channel invasion in 1944. Its codename was Overlord. Eisenhower would command. The main staging ground would be the very island where, 2 years earlier, a small contingent of U.S. troops had first trod London streets under curious eyes. As the date drew closer, the city that had watched those early parades became a nerve center of the greatest amphibious operation in history. Quays along the Thames heaved with supplies. South Coast ports choked with shipping and landing craft. Special units rehearsed assaults on quiet English beaches, guarded by military police and secrecy orders. The Allied command networks, born in the meetings of 1941 and tested in North Africa and Italy, now focused like a lens on one narrow stretch of French coastline. Churchill could recall, with almost painful clarity, the day he had first saluted American troops in London and told the world that Britain was no longer alone. Now, with Overlord looming, he faced a harsher truth. The alliance whose arrival had brought such relief would demand a terrible price in lives, British and American alike. On the eve of the invasion, as he walked once more through London's dim streets toward the underground war rooms, he knew that the meaning of that first parade would finally be measured not in words, but in blood on the beaches of Normandy. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the same city that had once watched a token American parade now lay under a low, heavy sky. In the underground cabinet war rooms, telephones shrilled and clerks bent over maps as word came in from the Channel. The great gamble was underway. All through the night, Allied convoys had been pushing toward the coast of Normandy, 5,000 ships and landing craft, thousands of aircraft overhead, and assault divisions packed into cramped holds. Among them were men from the very units that had first marched through London 2 years before, veterans now, no longer awkward in new uniforms, heading toward beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Churchill had tried, with characteristic recklessness, to go with them. He pressed to sail aboard a warship off the invasion beaches, even arguing that if the king insisted he stay, then George VI should come as well so that neither life would be valued above the other. The monarch gently but firmly refused. In the end, Britain's Prime Minister remained in London, pacing the map rooms, smoking endlessly, waiting for the first solid reports. By mid-morning, enough information had reached Whitehall for him to address the House of Commons. He spoke carefully, knowing that men were still dying on the sand as he rose. The landings, he reported, were proceeding with great success. British, Canadian, and American troops were ashore, establishing a beachhead on the coast of France. He did not hide the cost, but he framed the moment as the long-awaited fulfillment of Allied promises, the opening of that Western Front which Stalin had demanded and which the American public had expected. That evening, in a broadcast carried by the BBC, Churchill again turned to the language he had first used when those initial American columns marched through London. He described the invasion as the joint work of our armies and those of our American allies, stressing that the great assault had been planned and executed in absolute partnership. The liberation of Europe, he told listeners, would not be the victory of one nation but of a united coalition. For the American soldiers crouched behind Normandy sea walls, the memory of London's cheering crowds must have seemed very distant. Yet in a straight line of cause and effect, the D-Day beaches led back to that July day in 1942. The parade through the capital had signaled that British and American destinies were now interlocked. On the Channel coast in 1944, that interlocking was written in blood. What, then, had Churchill truly said when he first saw American troops march through London? Publicly, he had told his people that Britain was no longer alone, that the full power of the United States now stood beside them. He spoke of shared ideals, of two great democracies fighting not for conquest but for the survival of a civilization. To Americans, listening over static-filled radios, he presented Britain not as a supplicant but as a steadfast partner that had held the line until help could arrive. Privately, to colleagues and in later memoirs, his meaning was even starker. The sight of American soldiers on British soil confirmed what he had felt on the night of Pearl Harbor, that only with the United States fully engaged could Hitler and his allies be defeated. Those marching boots were, in his mind, the sound of eventual victory, even if the road to it would be long and cruel. By May 1945, as Allied armies, British, American, Canadian, and others, pushed into the ruins of Germany, Churchill stood on a balcony in Whitehall and looked out over a sea of jubilant faces. Above the crowd, Union Jacks waved beside stars and stripes. The partnership first dramatized by a modest parade had overturned the most dangerous tyranny Europe had ever known. Yet the moment also marked the passing of an age. The world that emerged from the Second World War was dominated not by the British Empire Churchill had spent his life defending, but by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain would remain America's closest ally, bound by what Churchill himself later called the special relationship, but never again would London stand alone as the center of global power. In that sense, the July 1942 procession through London was more than a morale-boosting spectacle. It was a hinge in history. When Churchill watched American troops march past the bomb-scarred buildings of his capital and told Britain that they were no longer alone, he was speaking not only about the war then raging, but about the shape of the age that would follow. The echo of those marching feet carried far beyond Whitehall, across the beaches of Normandy, through the ruins of Berlin, and into a new world order forged in alliance, born from the day a tired, embattled island welcomed an army from across the ocean into its streets.